Morning, everybody. I'm back after a short break for the summer to talk to people about creating a great place to work. And today we're going to be talking about culture in the workplace. I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Browning. She is the founder of Brown & York and Time for Kindness. So welcome, Sarah.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Very welcome. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Of course, yeah. So yes, I'm Sarah Browning, and I am a communicator and kindness cheerleader. So I work with organisations and individuals that have a vision of a kinder world. And I work with them to look at their communications primarily, to look at making sure they're using them effectively, and that the work that they do in terms of communicating with a whole range of different audiences adds up to supporting that vision of the kinder world. Kinder world means many things to many people, of course, and I'm particularly focusing at the moment working with organisations that are making the world kinder by changing attitudes and behaviours to self or others. And as part of that, or alongside that, earlier this year I set up a website called Time for Kindness, and that's all about sharing the stories of the kindness that already exists in the world. I think, I'm not denying that there's lots of horrible stuff that goes on, but equally, I think there's more kindness than we hear about. And actually, what I want to do with Time for Kindness and what the people who take part in Time for Kindness want to do is to sort of redress that balance, really. And I think sometimes people are perhaps a little bit shy or embarrassed about believing in kindness because it's a bit soft and a bit woolly. It's not. It's powerful. It's an incredibly powerful thing. And again, I think if we tell the stories of people who are doing kind things, that really helps us all to believe and to be part of a greater movement, if you like. So that's the Time for Kindness site. Is about an Instagram account, actually. It's about sharing stories and also blogs around, what happens, what happens when we are kind, in a whole range of scenarios.
That's a really powerful mission you're on there. And I think you're right. People don't talk about kindness quite so much. It doesn't make the headlines, but it can be a really powerful thing, especially if people are sort of suffering with poor mental health, for example, to hear about these stories of kindness rather than all the doom and gloom can be a really important factor in sort of helping a recovery there.
Absolutely. And people have said to me, they look at the site and they say, oh, it's so uplifting. And it's little stories as well. It's kind of stories of everyday kindness. So it might be, I'm published one recently about a kindness of a stranger who paid for something because somebody got to the front of the queue and didn't have enough change in their purse. It can be a small thing or just helping out a neighbour or whatever, but it's uplifting to hear those stories, as you say.
Absolutely. So, in terms of the organisations that you work with, what do you think would be the three most important things that a workplace can do to create a good culture or a culture of kindness?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because in some ways it's a very personal question, because I think, what one person deems to be, important in a workplace might be different for someone else. But I think some of the things that I see and that I help organisations to achieve, it's around the people and how people treat each other, that they do show kindness and respect to each other. And actually there's something I think about having a culture where people understand that we all have different experiences and different views and different perspectives. And actually we can be greater than the sum of our parts, really, if we listen to each other. And we don't have to agree on everything. That's not going to happen. That's unrealistic. But actually, if we listen to each other's perspectives and truly understand each other, and in the context of a workplace, I think it's around understanding that we are all on the same side. We might have different perspectives, we might bring different skills and different desires for outcomes, actually, for ourselves, but essentially we are on the same side. We are part of something together, and I think that's a really key thing about a workplace. I think there's something around clarity of direction. So yes, we are all in it together, but where are we going together? And that kind of as I say, we need to have that overall direction that we all understand. And then within that, what's our role? How do we all fit together? What's the bit that we're focusing on? Because particularly in larger organisations, although it will also be true in smaller ones. Your department, your team, your directorate, there'll be a specific part of the overall vision that you are responsible for, you are involved in. And my background is internal communications, and sometimes where it goes wrong is because there's sort of an imbalance around, that their work is more important than my work. It doesn't matter whether you're front of house, back office, fundraising, service delivery, all those parts are important. All those parts build together to make a workplace. So it is about communication of that direction. It's also about decision making, because again, sometimes when I see it go wrong, it's because there haven't been proper decisions, or the decisions are a little bit woolly at the top usually. So again, being really clear on kind of what the decision is and why, and then what our part is in that. I think, that aerial sort of kind of comes together to help with that clarity. Then the last thing I would say in terms of the kind of, the three things is around leadership. So I think, having leadership that recognises that we are all human beings, and that actually we are more than just our job. And I think that part of that is also demonstrating that they themselves are more than just their job, that actually they also have a life outside the office. This is of course presupposes that they do, but they will have things going on outside the office. I saw something on LinkedIn recently around a man, the chief exec, had said, well, what can I do to support women in my workplace? And the response had been, leave and pick your children up from school. Actually, that's one really big thing you can do to make it better for women in your workplace, because it becomes the norm, the acceptable thing to go and pick up your children, not something that, okay, well, if you have to. So that sort of leading by example, I think, is an important element as well.
I think you're right. Leading by example is so important. I see lots of examples in my work of things where the leadership don't quite get it right, and it ends up being a problem for the business. But something else I also see is that the senior leadership are doing a really good job of creating a healthy culture and healthy working practices. But actually it's the middle management that seem to be less on board. So how do you think businesses or organisations can create that good workplace culture across the board?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because like you say, it means different things to different people for a start off, doesn't it? So I think there is something in there around having a company-wide understanding around what's a good workplace culture. But I think it is about how the people behave, how they treat each other. And I think sometimes those middle managers, like you say, can get a little bit stuck in the middle. And so a lot of it, I think, is about listening. So, I've worked with clients where there's a sense of, I am told by senior people, oh, the middle managers are not doing their job. And actually the conditions are not there in a whole range of reasons for them to be able to do the things that the senior managers expect of them. Or it often is that there hasn't been communication between those senior managers and the middle ones. They've not had those explicit conversations about expectations. And sometimes you get those situations where the middle managers are either afraid to speak up to the senior people and say, this is a problem, or and I think this is that kind of, again, that is the kindness of culture, is that being able to either own up when you have done something wrong and not be fearful of consequences, or actually feel that if something isn't working, it's going to be seen as your fault and your failure. Whereas actually, again, if we're all in it together and we're all heading for that same end point, there is a value in us all having conversations to say, okay, this isn't working. Let's listen to the people who are there in that position, who know why it's not working, and let's see what we can do about it, rather than sort of coming in and telling them off.
That's so important, actually, is making sure people are actually empowered to speak up without the fear of consequences, because we're all human, we all make mistakes. And I do think those middle managers are sometimes, really sort of squeezed in the middle. They're sort of stuck between the rock and a hard place. They get it from the top, they get it from below. And it can be really tough for them. And I mean, I think one way that businesses and organisations can deal with that is by giving them proper training on a variety of different things. Obviously, you'd be training on communication. I'd be perhaps giving training on what the law says, what they can and can't do.
Yeah.
But I think they're often overlooked, and it can be really tough for them. So how do you think that employers can ensure that their employees understand their culture and sort of what's expected of them?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, and unfortunately, I'm going to let myself down by not remembering where I read this quote. But I know a few years ago, I read the quote: "Culture is not something that can be emailed out." And I thought that's really a useful reminder, I think, because, you know, you can get into a situation where you think as leaders, you think you've set a culture because you've been through, and I'm sure we've both worked with organisations where they've been through a fantastic process to develop their values. It may even be collaborative, that they've brought people in, they've had the conversation, they've got the words on the wall, and then they move on. And actually, that's sort of just the start of it. That's the kind of setting those expectations, or starting from kind of what we think we're aiming for. But actually, it is about the behaviours that people experience day to day, and having open, explicit conversations about, okay, so these are the words. What does this look like day to day? What does this how would we know that we are being kind, or we are being go-getting, or we are being whatever, the words are? And actually, and again, this comes into some of, I think, those middle managers being empowered to lead some of those conversations, actually, because it will be different depending on what part of the organisation you're working in. So kindness, as an example, if you're working in a factory, kindness might be shown by making sure that the machines are regularly maintained and are safe, so that your colleagues don't hurt themselves when they're going about their job. Kindness in an office environment may perhaps be that you make sure that you're in a meeting in the conference room or on Zoom and everyone has a chance to speak and is listened to and heard. That might also apply in a factory, but your environment will dictate some of what it looks like. So I think in terms of that kind of, what can they do? It's bringing that culture, not just assuming it will happen, because also you get that thing around assumptions sometimes, don't you? Where one group assume it means this and another group assume it means something else. There's not necessarily right and wrong, but if you're thinking there are different things, then that's when you're going to get clashes, because they don't understand, or they are doing this. Whereas actually, if we come together as we, then we can kind of work through that and see, where we can get to, so we can move forward together.
Have you got any sort of suggestions on how people can actually speak up in meetings? This is something that I see quite a lot, and I know this isn't something we've discussed previously, but quite often it seems to be the people that shout the loudest or are the most sort of outwardly confident are the ones that get their voices heard, and that can be a real problem for any organisation, but especially at board level. If you've just got people that agree with you, or don't want to speak up for fear of being ridiculed or not being listened to properly, is there any sort of practical tips you could offer there?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range of things, isn't there? So for a startup, I think there are some tips for, if we're talking specifically in a meeting environment, for the person that is chairing that meeting and leading that meeting. To recognise, and in fact for all of us to recognise that we are all different, and therefore for some people it will be about speaking up. I'm somebody who thinks and speaks at the same time, which can be disastrous, but I've learned over the years to try and make it more effective. But nevertheless, I process out loud, whereas there are other people who are more introverted, who it will all be going on in here, and they're much quieter. And so I think for the person that's in charge of the meeting to either have, or if you don't have, get a bit more understanding of the other people within a meeting, so that you recognise that there may be others who aren't speaking up at the moment, but that you perhaps need to speak to one-to-one, either before the meeting to gather their thoughts, or perhaps afterwards, depending on the what purpose of the meeting and so on. On Zoom, actually, or online, there are practical ways that people who perhaps don't want to speak up can contribute more easily, because of course you have the chat functions. So actually they can, you know, put in their thoughts that way. I think one of the worst things is if you know someone isn't speaking up, but they've got a point to make, that you sort of put them on the spot by kind of, so Charlotte, what do you think? You're not saying much. That's awful for somebody who isn't comfortable with speaking up. So it's finding alternative routes to kind of get their thoughts. I also think, I mean, years ago, I had somebody who worked for me who, in one of our one-to-ones, she kind of said something along the lines of, oh, you know, I don't get heard in meetings. I wish I could be sort of heard and speak up. And we talked about where that was coming from and what did she mean by wanting to be heard. And actually what it came down to for her was that she, what made a difference for her was where she sat in the meeting. So actually, if she sat next to the chair, she sat next to the person that was leading the meeting, she felt more confident to speak up and speak to the person sitting next to her, who was the chair, rather than be at the other end of some big table and trying to be noticed. And so she started doing that, and it made a massive difference to her and actually to us as an organisation, because she had some amazing ideas that were being missed. But it was something as on the face of it, simple as that, that made big difference. So again, I think it's knowing the other people, but also it's knowing yourself and thinking for yourself, okay, what can I do? What would make a difference? Perhaps rather than just accepting a kind of narrative that you have or that has been given to you that I'm not listened to, I'm not going to be heard. Well, what would help? What would make the difference?
Fantastic example, and I've never thought of that at all, but it's certainly something I will now look out for in meetings that I'm involved in. And I think I read something recently, I think it's published by the BBC actually, about how introverts have really flourished working from home. Yeah. And I think that's because they've had the quiet, the headspace to do their work. As you say, with meetings on Zoom, you can raise your hand, you can have a chat, use the chat function. So it's a different way of communicating, but it's working really well for different people. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And as I say, you know, it is about the chair being able to balance, or not balance, but incorporate what's going on the screen in terms of people speaking, but also keeping an eye on what people have written and so on. And, you know, maybe it's something where, and again, this isn't always going to be appropriate, but maybe it's somewhere where previously we'd have made decisions there and then and quickly or whatever, but we have to accept that there's a new way of working, means it will not be in that moment, but we will take that pause to look at everything and before we kind of rush a decision. That's not always going to work, obviously, but where it does work.
It's really interesting that we do now have this new way of working, don't we? I've been advising lots of people on hybrid working, and the world has changed actually. So many people, employees and employers and managers, senior leaderships, you know, we've all got new skills to learn here. Well, what I'm hoping for, as you know, is make the workplace a better place. You're obviously hoping the workplace is going to become much kinder. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity at the moment to really shape the world. In terms of sort of where we are at the moment, things are in flux. But what one thing do you think employers or leaders can do to really quickly improve the workplace? Because it's very difficult at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. So I had written a note about that, but actually I think I'm going to say something slightly different, because I think, particularly when we talk about hybrid working and so on, we're getting quite hung up on the kind of the delivery and the mechanics. And actually, if we start with, well, what's our objective here? What are we trying to achieve? What's the outcome we want from this hybrid working? And therefore, what do we collectively need to be in place in order to achieve that? So I think there is something about that kind of understanding that the delivery mechanism is not really the point. And I think sometimes leaders, managers can get a bit controlling in terms of that's why they want people in front of them, because they can control that. But actually, if we are all in this together, and actually the outcome we want is an organisation where we all feel like we're in it together and we're all going to move forward together. For some people, that will mean they want to be in the office to see their colleagues and have a chat and so on. But for others, it will be that they want to be at home so they can get their head down and get their work done, because that is their contribution. But if we start from the, well, what were we actually trying to achieve, and what difference will it make ultimately to our clients, our shareholders, our service users, whoever is your stakeholder that you are doing it for, you know, and so it's that more kind of strategic approach, which actually does link to the note I had made for myself before we started speaking today, because I think there is something about one of the best leaders I've ever, I didn't work for him, but I came across a friend of mine. He ran his organization on the basis that nobody comes to work to do a bad job. And so starting from that point, I mean, it was about trust, essentially. It was about trusting his people to do the right thing, to make the right choices, because they knew what they were trying to achieve. And they were given that sort of trust and autonomy to make decisions within that framework. And that made a massive difference. And I think some of the kind of concerns around hybrid working, where, oh, we must have everyone here, it's because you don't trust your people at home. Well, if you don't trust your people, then I would say that the hybrid working is not your problem. Your problem is actually, why don't you trust them? Are you recruiting the wrong people? Are you not training them properly? Are you not making it clear how it all links together? You know, there's a whole other lot of stuff. And as much as you tinker with who's in the office and who's in their spare room at home, that fundamental trust piece, I'm not saying it's easy to solve, don't get me wrong, but you're looking at the wrong thing, I would say.
Absolutely, that's such an important point to make. I've been seeing a lot in the press about certain businesses mandating 50% in the office, or 3 days a week in the office, 2 days at home. And just having that, again, it's that kind of black and white set rules, which won't work for everybody. It's not particularly flexible. People, dependent on their personality type, whether they're extroverted, introverted, do their best work in different ways, in different places. And as you mentioned, some people might want to be in 5 days a week, some people might not want to. I think there's a real opportunity here to have a lot more flexibility with the hybrid arrangement. But as you say, it comes down to trust. And I mean, this will be a whole separate topic I'm sure we could talk about for ages. But again, the main issue would be whether they're recruiting the right people, but also if you've got somebody that's a leader or a manager that feels the need to micromanage everybody, that's not going to be a good workplace culture. That's then touches on health and safety executive rules in relation the guidance on good mental health in the workplace, about people having control over their working day. And it's just a recipe for disaster. And that, I mean, that's another topic that I'm sure we can talk about significantly on. But yeah, there's a real problem there. But I also think there's a real opportunity to get this hybrid thing right, and to make sure it works for everybody.
Absolutely, I think you're right, and it's about asking why, isn't it? I think I mean, certainly in relation to communications in particular, I get my clients to use the 5 whys technique a lot, which is basically just ask yourself why 5 times until you drill down to the real core of what you're trying to achieve. And I wonder whether that is something which more organizations could apply in terms of why are they wanting people in the office or not? Why are they feeling they have to mandate for 50% and so on? And I think there is something as well I'm sort of seeing bubbling up more and more now around who sets what the standard and norms are for an organization. I'm having a conversation, this is sort of going slightly off topic, but it's an element of culture really. I was having a conversation with somebody recently about young people coming into the workplace and an 18-year-old coming in wearing a short skirt and a skimpy top and having a conversation about whether that was appropriate for the workplace or not. And actually there is a level at which who says that's inappropriate? Who's to say that the 18-year-old isn't what they want to wear? That's sort of being judged against a level of appropriateness that was probably set by an older, probably white colleague at some point. And so, you know, I think there's some interesting, as you say, kind of real opportunities at the moment for organizations to rethink some of those kind of, what are we, and you know, what do we hold up as our norm? What do we hold up as appropriate, and why? And the world has moved on. So actually, is that still appropriate? It might have been appropriate when we first felt like this about 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. See the categories. So I think, you know, there's a whole opportunity around that as well. Oh, and a tail as well.
I came across the 5 whys in I don't remember which book it was, but a book I read last year. And I thought that's a really good technique. Just don't teach my toddler it yet. I know we're going to have that why phase at some point.
I have done talks about the 5 whys technique that I titled "Channel You're in a Toddler" for exactly that reason.
I'm dreading it when it comes, but it will. Well,
thank you. Sometimes.
Thank you so much for sharing with us all your wisdom on these topics.
Oh,
and so we've obviously sort of touched on something I read in a book. The final question I always ask everybody is what's the best book you've read this year?
Oh, that's almost like asking me to choose my favourite child. I only have one, so I find that question very easy. So I've gone for a couple of things. One that I'm reading at the moment, which actually is a sort of worky book, if you like. So I'm a trustee for a charity, and I'm reading a book at the moment called "It's a Battle on the Board" by a lady called Deborah Alcott Tyler. And it's all about the relationship between a trustee board and a chief exec, and how that works, and the management team, and how that works. As I say, it's in the realm of the charity world, but I'm sure there are things that are applicable across all types of different organizations where you've got different groups kind of with different responsibilities working together. It's written in a fantastic style, so it's really easy to read in that sense, but it's really making me think. And I've been a trustee for a long time. She's really going for it. I've been a trustee for a long time, and it's still making me stop and think, oh yeah, actually, do I do that? Perhaps I would be better to rethink something. So there's that one. And then the other one, earlier this year I read Jay Blades, who's a TV presenter. He does the Repair Shop on TV, and I think he's got another one on at the moment, program on at the moment, his autobiography, and I would highly recommend it to everybody, because he had a difficult background. He's had some really tough times in his life, and every time he's got himself up, he's moved forward. He's had some very, very dark times, but he's always had that kind of optimism and resilience. And he does a lot to help other people, because he's got a lot of empathy in terms of, that's what it's like for me. I know what it might be like for you, and here's a way to, to move forward. So it's a very uplifting and hopeful book, and I would highly recommend it. And I'm not on commission.
I've not heard of either of those, so I'll definitely be adding them onto my reading list. Thank you so much for sharing those with us, and we look forward to maybe speaking to you again sometime soon.
Absolutely, it's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you.